Great Monday, and welcome to the Fully Human Connections podcast. I'm your host, King, and I'm joined by my co-host, Reggie. How you doing today, Reggie?
Doing real well, King. It's really good to be with you on a Monday morning, and especially good to be back with you because last couple of weeks we had some technical difficulties. So it looks like we're going to be good to go today.
Yeah, I'm hoping that it made some changes, and so those changes hopefully will eliminate or significantly reduce the amount of buffering and delay that we had in the video before. You know, everything I've learned in life, especially the older I've gotten, is that life is nothing but a series of challenges. And that's how I begin to look at it. There's no good things or there's no bad things, just challenges. And either you're ready for those challenges or you're not. And if you have a positive mindset and you're doing the right things as far as feeding yourself the right information, surrounding yourself with the right people, then you're going to be able to face those challenges with the right attitude, the right energy, and eventually you will come up with a resolution that works. So that's what I firmly believe, and hopefully this podcast bears fruit and plays itself out. If not, then we'll continue to keep working on those challenges until we do resolve them. So,
yep, sounds good to me.
So, with that being said, what's your spiritual energy number?
I'm a 10, as I always say, slightly jokingly, but very seriously. As a good friend of mine says, that the spiritual energy is a choice. So even if I didn't feel it this morning, I can just choose to have it. And so I'm always going to show up that way with you.
Absolutely. I concur. I'm a 10 as well. I don't see the logic in choosing, and I believe it is a choice. Any number less than 10, even though I feel 10 in an exact moment throughout the day. I know that I'm going to do something to put myself at a 10 because, again, it's completely up to me. And you feel a 10 just changes everything about how I look at life and my outlook. How I greet people, the energy I give off, as well as how open my mind is to receive new information and growth as well. So, how about you go ahead and share what you're grateful for this morning?
Yeah, so I'm grateful for my indoor plumbing, my refrigerator with food in it, and for heat. It's about 35 degrees outside, and we've been getting nickeled and dimed with an inch of snow here, an inch and a half there, and half an inch there, some freezing rain. And it's good. It's good to have a nice warm place. And also, I'm grateful for the most part, healthy physical body that allows me to move the snow and get a little bit sore and then recover, because it's not the same body I had when I was 25 or 35 or 45. So it takes a little bit longer to recover, but it still does that. Still kind of naturally returns to a kind of a healthy state. So I'm grateful for that. Grateful that I get to get up in the morning and do work I care about, and grateful for our friendship and our conversations.
Excellent. Well, I'm grateful for my life, my health, my ability to see, hear, walk, talk, stand, breathe, have sound mind. I'm grateful for a mother who's alive, who has sound mind, who I can still connect with her love, energy, and experience things. That's what Sundays are for, and got a chance to spend Sunday with her as well. And like I said, my mother's in a position where now my brother and myself have to provide for her. And so that's a new chapter in our lives. And she's grateful for that, and just being able to cook. She's actually teaching me to become a better cook, and that's something else. Like I said, I love learning and just experiencing new things. I'm also grateful for the opportunity to experience in Baltimore this year, just, watching the run they had. Of course, I wish they had, finished the job, but just being able to see, football played at a high level. I tell you, just on that level, on that point, I should say, just really impressed with the Ravens organization, compared to the one that's, South. Well, they got new owners now, but just watching it, how a team that has a good owner, good coaches, good management, and just how they manage to run their organization at a very professional level, and you see what they're able to produce. Now, you don't always win, but you're always competitive, and you're always in a position to win. That's a motion that I really hope a team, a professional organization can do. And I use it as a guide for me in business. Just how can I be better? How can I grow? What can I learn from my mistakes? And then more importantly, how to really continue to connect and build with the right people. Yeah. Because, when you lose on a sports level, obviously everyone's looking at that and you say, well, here's what we need. We need this, either we need this kind of receiver, we need this kind of running back, we need these kind of coordinators. You start thinking about who you need to add to your life or to the team in order to make another run next year. But people don't do that when it comes to their lives. When you either are not working toward the goal as diligently and committed as you should be, or you're failing, you don't look at who do I need to replace in my life and who do I need to change, and I use that as a metaphor. So just thankful for that line of thinking this morning, and then finally thankful to be here with you, and hopefully have resolved the technical issues we already talked about before. I'm just looking forward to a great conversation today, as well as a great day. So that being said, why don't you walk us into our topic for today, Reggie?
Yeah, so we've been speaking about healing America's narratives. This title of my book. The subtitle is The Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow, Becoming More Fully Human. And we've been doing this for over a year and a half now. And today we're going to zero in on some of the particulars of that subtitle, the feminine and the masculine, and how they inform our collective national shadow. What we live in, and it's become somewhat kind of dated or unconventional to use this word nowadays, but it's still true. We live in a patriarchy. It was founded by white men who had come from Europe, who were ruled by kings and queens, mostly kings, and it was patriarchal. And we've made progress, but we were nowhere near being through with that. And we'll get into the nuts and bolts of what I mean by that in a couple of minutes. But more specifically, we live in a culture where our young boys and girls are prepared and conditioned, generally speaking, to continue to play their given roles in the patriarchy. More to the point, and this is based in research. Anybody who's interested in this can just begin with Carol Gilligan, Harvard educated psychologist who's now down at New York University. But her research and many of her students' research, she's in her 80s now, so she's been around for a while, really point to this idea that by the time a young boy is between the ages of 4 and 7, he's already been taught to let go of the softer, more feminine, what we would call the more feminine sides of himself, and to be a real man, to be a tough guy, to man up, and to basically to know things and not so much care. Girls, and this happens a little bit later with the girls, but by the time they're in early adolescence, and that coincides with the time where their bodies begin to grow into the bodies of women, they become increasingly more expected to play the role of the woman, of the nurturer, of the carer. And so what the researchers found, that young boys would very often say, "I don't care." And young girls, actually early adolescent girls, would begin to use the phrase, "I don't know." So the knowing part of being a rational human being was being acculturated out of the young women. And the caring part of being an emotionally healthy human being was being nurtured. I shouldn't say nurtured, but being taken away from the boys. Now that's a real kind of tip of the iceberg. We're not saying that every girl grows up that way, or every boy, because the research has been around for over 40 years now. So there's been some progress made. But still, if we look at our culture, if we look at our entertainers and our sports and our news media and our politicians, you can still see the impact of the, I'll just say, patriarchy again, and this binary hierarchical system where men are a certain way, women are a certain way, and it begins in childhood. So that's what we're going to look at today. And I'll put a pin in it there. I'll just stop and get your response, and we can take off.
Well, again, gratitude for choosing such a great topic. It's timely as usual. I think about when you talk about that, the way I was raised, and the culture and the area and the environment I grew up in. To your point, and I've said this before on the show, but I'll say it again now since it's really relative to the topic we're having today, is your identity. Your identity first starts off, you understand you're a male. And you're told, okay, you're a male, this is what's expected of you, little boys do this. And so you grow up into that mindset of trying to be a male and with that image. And of course, if you have males around you, either fathers or uncles or older brothers, they're guiding you in what should be the qualities, the traits, characteristics of being a male. And I remember vividly that one of the things that really stood out, and it's really emphasized in being a male at a young age, is how many women or young girls at that age you're dating, and being celebrated for dating more than one. So if you're dating one young girl, then you look at it as being a little more feminine, not being feminine, but less masculine, let me say that, than someone who may have 3 or 4 girlfriends at that early age. So you're taught that males operate in a certain way and must have several young girls they're dealing with. And so it's no wonder why a lot of my friends I grew up with, high school, close friends, were all fathers before they were 25. Mm-hmm. So before they even got a chance to really grow up and become men in the context of maturity of men, male just being the male species, but now acting as a man, to me, is a different set of characteristics. And now you're having children because you're engaging in the activity of sexual intercourse that you wasn't prepared and didn't understand what it really meant. You were just doing something because you were told this is what males do. And the more you have, the more of a male you are. And even though those same uncles, the brothers went through those same things and had kids at early ages, they didn't relate that wisdom to you as far as you should be a little more careful and selective and disciplined when it comes to how you conduct yourself as a male. So when you talk about today's topic, that's what really comes to my mind first and foremost. It's my own personal upbringing and just how that pretty much shaped my life. And I had to go through the conditioning that I had to go through to start to see that I had to transition from being, as far as mentality, being a male man, and through my identity shifts throughout my life to where I am right now. So I really think it's important because, as you said before, you really see that in everything we watch. Whether we watch sitcoms, we saw the male dynamic, the patriarchal dynamic being there. I remember watching Leave It to Beaver. I can still watch, remember those shows vividly. And I remember, Ward Cleaver going to work and June Cleaver staying home, and June Cleaver's job was always to be beautiful. So even though she stayed home and she raised the kids, she was always in the beautiful dress, and she was always, parents-wise, beautiful. And it makes me think about how women talk about being, how men objectify them. And it started back to those early shows, because it was like the women never could look down or look just normal as a housewife. She had to be beautiful, and of course men can come in and look any way they wanted to from a hard day's work, but a woman had to be looked at as being beautiful. So I just kind of now wanted to shift it for me personally to talking about how our culture really reinforced those stereotypes as well.
Yeah, so that's a great example. There's a wonderful quote from Brene Brown, the sociologist who did a lot of research on shame and vulnerability. I don't know the quote, but basically she talks about women who were expected to raise the kids, clean the house. He went down the whole list and look beautiful doing it and never break a sweat. And that basically, and anybody who's ever taken care of a child, whether it's 1 or 5 or 10, knows that you break a sweat if you're a parent. So, but yeah, I think that's really important. And even with our knowledge base, even with the progress that's been made, and there's definitely progress been made. I mean, just I'm not going to point to specific. I'll point to a couple of specifics, but if you look at the United States Congress, if you look at entertainment, there are many, many more women who are recognized for their talent and for their power. I mean, arguably, I know Republicans won't like this, but Nancy Pelosi is arguably one of the most powerful speakers of the House in American history. She's no longer Speaker of the House, obviously. The Republicans are having a hard time holding on to one. But if we look at sports nowadays, there are, because of Title IX, which was an extension of the Civil Rights Act back in, I think it was 1971 or 2, don't quote me on the date. So there had to be equal opportunity and expenditures in education for women and men, and not just in sports, but sports is the one that gets talked about as much. Even with that, what has generally happened is that the biases and the patriarchal influence has become more nuanced. So we can look at Oprah Winfrey, we can look at Congresswoman Barbara Lee, we can look at Senator Elizabeth Warren, we can look at various women in various professions, and it's definitely better, but there is still this underlying belief, once we get past the elite, and the people I just mentioned are elite, they're in the United States Congress, if they're a famous actor or talk show host or author or influencer, which Oprah Winfrey is. When we get down to where most of us live, it's different. The equality isn't as easy to come by, and it comes down to, again, where there are these expectations, and it impacts men in an unhealthy way as well. So we're not saying that men have it made and they're in charge of everything, because only the wealthy, powerful men, most of whom are white, are in charge of everything. Right? I didn't grow up being in charge of everything. My father, who was a first generation Italian American, whose parents just spoke a little bit of English, he didn't grow up in charge of anything. He was a plumber. So there still is this patriarchy, which has two characteristics. It's binary, masculine and feminine, and it's hierarchical. The masculine is on top. The men are, superior to the women. Something we spoke about in one of the episodes, in fact, you raised this, and I'm glad that you did, that where we had the tech problems, speaking about some of the broadcast journalists who are women who are working in the NFL. And they're talking to the players, doing interviews and different things. And I forget the specific critique you provided. So maybe you can go back to that. And because I think we were beginning to get into an important piece there when the technology kind of stopped us. So can you speak a little bit about that again?
Yeah, I was talking about specifically how the former NFL player Cam Newton came out and made a comment that there's a difference between when it comes to quarterbacks, game managers, and game changers, and that caused a lot of controversy because the quarterbacks that he named as game managers and the ones he named as game changers, a lot of different analysts didn't really agree with it at the time. They felt that he was insulting certain quarterbacks by calling them game managers. And that wasn't his intention, but that's how they received it. So as a result, the different analysts were talking about that, discussing that. And I noticed that the women analysts that are not all women analysts, but specific women analysts, or woman analysts, had made the comment of how when she talked about his comment, she didn't talk about analyzing his critique. She chose to talk about him as a result, to discredit him, as though to say, because you're not playing anymore, and because the end of your career, you wasn't as exceptional as you were, and discounted all the achievements and accomplishments of his career. But talking about the way he dresses and the fact that his opinion was not really valid because he's making a podcast now and he's not someone that should be considered worthy of listening to his critique. And it's really interesting is that when men who are former players, they can make those kind of comments. I use the reference of Charles Barkley, how Charles Barkley will comment about how a player dresses constantly, how they look, their hairline being too far back, and they'll make jokes. Him and Shaq will make jokes. So it's tolerated when men do it because I believe it's because they played before. And it's like, if you played, then you can comment and joke around about other men. But if you're going to be a woman, then you better, there's certain territories that you got to stay out of. You have to stay within a certain lane. Now, whether it's fair or not, I see the validity in it to a certain extent, because if it's like, deal with what the man said, his critique, and not dealing with what your opinion of him is. And to me, the natural is almost to the point where a woman who's not mindful of, conscious of the dynamics of that she's operating in, then obviously the sports media, which is a male-dominated field, talking about a male-dominated sport, you have to understand that you can't bring in, and typically that what happens in most, at least from my experience, most female and male relationships, is that females have a way that they can tear a man down in a conversation. They can get real personal with you, and that's what has a tendency to get most men, a lot. Again, I'm not speaking of all, I'm not generalizing all men and all women when I say this. I'm speaking specifically about my experience and the women I know I've dealt with in my life. I had women in my life who at the same time, they would take things very personal with their comments, whether it's a conversation that to win the argument is where I'm going with it. So that's where I was saying that to me is how, and the backlash this woman received as a result of not talking about Cam Newton's comments, but specifically dealing with how he dressed and the fact that he was not playing in the NFL anymore. So his comments really, and since he wasn't a professional analyst, his comments really weren't warranted, or he really didn't have any basis for making those comments.
Yeah. So thanks for that. And there's actually a lot going on in there. So I'm gonna tease apart a couple of things that I'm hearing, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one thing I wanted to separate, because we went to Barkley, I think, and I love Charles Barkley for a lot of reasons, but there's a big divide between professional basketball and professional football, because there are women who are very talented basketball players who now play and have played professionally. There aren't women. The NFL isn't male dominated. It's an exclusive male club. There aren't, I don't know if there's ever going to be a woman who plays in the NFL. Yeah, in one way, I hope so. Another way, somebody else can get, a traumatic brain injury. So I don't know how if that's a really great move to get equal rights. But more to the point, there's this. Let me get to the thing that's beyond the gender first. So there is this tendency in politics and in sports or whatever, when some people disagree on an issue, they disagree on the issue. That's what we want to do. Here's what he said. Here's my argument against what he said, and we go back and forth. Then there's the people who use, what they call the ad hominem arguments, where rather than arguing against your point, I attack you. So that happens in politics, happens in sports, and it usually happens, and this is a judgment on my part, it comes from small-minded people who really don't have a legitimate argument in terms of whatever's on the table. So rather than showing their ignorance or their incompetence to really join in the conversation, they attack the person. Now, I don't know if this woman did that, if she was guilty of that or not, but that happens in a lot of different places. More to the point of the female broadcaster who did that. And you said this. I mean, the NFL is the patriarchy. I mean, that it's a completely male entity. The teams are for-profit entertainment companies, and the NFL itself is amazingly a not-for-profit association of owners.
Right.
How they get away with that is God bless them, but that's a great move for the NFL. And that's not the only sport that has that. So if you're a female journalist, a sports journalist who wants to, have commentary or report on sports and specifically on football, I mean, you're in the out group. There are in groups and out groups, again, everywhere, in sports, in politics, in war, in families, in neighborhoods. And by definition, because you've never played the game and because biologically you're a woman, you really have to prove yourself. Some of the mistakes or the learning curve that might be granted to a retired football player or a professional journalist who's a male, the woman's not going to get that for the most part. And so the playing field itself, no pun intended, is already uneven for a female journalist in professional football. And first, I admire somebody who wants to try to break in there and do a good job. And some of them do a good job, especially the worst interviews in any sport are those where you get the coach or one of the players at halftime when they're going into the locker room or they're coming out from the locker room. And especially if it's the losing one, and you have to ask them some really pointed questions and they just want to go and play the game, but contractually, they actually have to have those interviews. It's part of what they're contracted to do with the networks and the NFL or the NBA or whatever it happens to be. So there's this underneath all of that. We can say, oh, look, there's a woman on the field doing interviews. Great. We're making progress. And there's this and there's that. But again, if you look at the larger picture, it's a male sport. Not male dominated, it's completely male in the NFL. And the biases are definitely there. And it hurts both the men and the women. Not equally, I don't think, because there aren't that many women involved, because of the expectations. Because, a lot of men, and I would say a lot of men in hyper-masculine situations, and that includes sports, especially football, the military, law enforcement, where being a man means something very specific. different than if you're a first grade teacher and you're a man. And so for the women who are dedicated enough and competent enough and willing to go and try to work in those venues, it's a tough move to make. So I don't have a resolution to that. I don't know what the resolution is, except that in the big picture, over generations, if we allow and this is where we began, if we allow our boys and girls as they grow up to be more fully human, so the boys are allowed to care and the girls are allowed to know, so that the main thing that differentiates them is their literal biology. But the cultural expectations are simply that they be kind, loving, strong, fair, merciful, just, compassionate, wise human beings, as opposed to putting the boys over here and the girls over there. We might lose a lot of that judgment that is acculturated by the time we're into adulthood. So I know that was kind of a bit of a long rant there, so I'll be quiet now.
No, I think what you said is on point. But I also want to add this to make sure our listening audience understands that my point I was making was not all women analysts have this issue. There's just specific ones. Actually, there's a minority, to be honest. There are some great women analysts who truly analyze the game, the statistics, the techniques of the game, the players, their background. And as long as they stay within that space, there's no issues. As a matter of fact, they get respected. Men love to sit there and be on their shows or have conversations, interviews with them, and so on and so forth. It's just the minority of women who may be good writers, but like I said, they allow themselves to get caught up into the game of, to which you, I forgot the term you use, but to take it personal.
Yeah, the ad hominem, which is a Latin phrase that I just know because I've seen it a bunch of places. Yeah.
So they went there, like I said, and it's not just football. I've seen it on the basketball court, and as a result, men who watch these shows hate these particular women. Again, it's a minority of women who do this. I can count them on my hand, to be honest, of the women who fit in that category of always taking it personal and not stand with specifics of the game, and it's because they never played the game. So they really can't get into the techniques and the technical aspects of the game. And I would really like to say, I think it's also because they don't study it the same way that some women analysts who do, who haven't played football, but maybe been raised around football, whose brothers, uncles, husbands play football, talk about football, and they can sit down with you and talk about football to a deeper level than most men can. Because to your point, they see themselves and truly take a seriousness to the craft of being a journalist and analyst. And regardless of whether they're analyzing, they're going to sit here and do a great job. But, it was funny, as I was listening to you discuss that, what immediately popped to my mind was listening to Donald Trump. And again, we always talk about Donald Trump as a perfect example about this whole, dichotomy of just not growing, not being a person of working to heal America's narratives. And how when he talks about when he ran against Hillary Clinton, some of the comments he made about her, and now he's making similar comments about Nikki Haley. Like, she's a bird brain, and it's like, so again, it's an intelligence insult you're giving her, where some of the men you didn't give an intelligence insult, So it's interesting to see how, again, that stereotype is there, even when we discuss, like you said, the politics, taking it personal, get away from the issues. Now, of course, we know Donald Trump never really brings up the issues that his opponents. It's always going to be personal with him. That's his style, which he's making politics become that way. And so now the Republican Party is kind of saying, well, in order to really stay and get because of the fact that we're no longer the majority of the country, we have to win by being really hyper focused on our base, and our base wants to hear those kind of things, typically those insults, that fear, that kind of language. So let me double down on some of those kind of that terminology and those insults. But I wanted to ask you a question, so I just really wanted to clarify that again. I wasn't talking about all women, and that the majority of women actually are great analysts. But I actually want to shift the conversation away from sports and really talk about how, on a intimate level or relationship level between a man and a woman, not necessarily intimate, but even in a working situation, women who have been raised, as you say, to be that I don't know, and the men who, to sum it up, are saying I don't care. Watching that dynamic play out in a working environment, professional environment, where there's a woman who may actually be the manager or the supervisor, and her subordinates, her direct reports may be men. Watching the dynamic play itself out in that, it's like men who wasn't really raised to have women as leaders, I see, have a problem with that. And they really fight with their soul. In other words, they're not even listening to what the woman's saying. It's the fact that a woman is telling me this. It's a problem. But what's interesting, again, speaking about my background now and growing up, I have very strong women in my life, whether it's my mother, whether it's my aunts. And so I was used to watching women in the leadership roles, giving orders, being the person who makes decisions. So for me, I never had an issue with a woman supervisor. As a matter of fact, I think most of my working career, definitely my early 20s and 30s, I had women supervisors. And it never occurred to me that I shouldn't listen to her, or I discredit what she said, or she wasn't as smart or as intelligent or as professional as some of the men counterparts that she worked with. So I just wanted to ask, what are your thoughts as it relates to a more professional environment?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the general trajectory of what you said, and your personal examples, I mean, are great. You know, growing up with strong women, having a strong mother is a big deal, because then when you bump into a strong woman later on in your life, it's not like a surprise or anything. So I mean, that's that kind of a brief oversimplification of it. But back to let's take your example away for a second and go back to those men who never had any experience with a woman being in a position of superiority, in the hierarchy of a given company. One of the things that Gilligan found in her research when she was talking to these early to middle adolescent girls, the girls who were taught to not know, when she would ask them a question about something that happened in their lives, and they would give an answer that to the researcher sounded like it was a kind of almost like a cliched answer, or the answer that the adolescent girl was supposed to give, and so the researcher, in this case Gilligan, would follow up and say, is that true? This is not a quote, but is that true, or do you really think that? And so very often, when given that opportunity, the girls would say, well, do you want to know what I think or what I really think? Or do you want to know what I think or what I actually think? Do you really want to know what I actually think? So really and actually kept coming up. And what the researchers found was that even though the girls would say, I don't know, in order not to upset the apple cart, the patriarchal apple cart, they did know, but they learned to say, I don't know, in order to protect themselves in the patriarchy, because it would create a lot of problems if they stood up and did know and asserted themselves. So that's somewhat the research found. So now we move into this woman who is, let's say she's a director or a manager or even in a C-suite in some company somewhere. And not easy for her to get there. And she needs to be able to both, I'm going to use the language of the binary in order to do this, even though it's the thing we're trying to shine a light on. So the feminine traits of caring, of connection, of relationship, of compassion. So for a woman in a place of leadership, especially in the business world, or God forbid in the military, she's expected to be able to hold on to those traditionally feminine traits while still embodying enough of the masculine traits of traditional patriarchal leadership, and to walk that line. So one of my colleagues, Leslie Williams, who was my teacher, she's a consultant and a coach down in the DC area. She's worked in probably almost every department of the federal government and private companies as well. And she talks about grace and grit, to find that balance of grace and grit as a female leader. Because if you really step too much into the grit, the masculine piece, you get called by the men who report to you, or even your male colleagues, you become a bitch because they don't like your strength. If you have too much of the grace and not enough of the grit, you're not a strong leader. You lack leadership quality. So for a woman in those positions, it's really tough to walk that line of grace and grit, masculine and feminine. And for a man who's being asked to be led by this woman, it's also problematic, because especially if, unlike you, he's never been in a position to have to do what a strong woman tells him to do. So and that still remains. If we can look at the middle and upper leadership across, say, the Fortune 500 companies and a lot of other private companies, there's definitely progress, but there's still a male-dominated field in business leadership. So it's an issue that is still working to be resolved, and the vast majority of the leaders we're speaking about, men and women, I'm going to guess, aren't aware of what we're talking about the research, about moral reasoning through the early days of Lawrence Kohlberg's research and Carol Gilligan's subsequent research, and Judy Chu, who did a lot of research on young boys. It's in the cultural givens are still ruling us, and progress has been made. So there's a paradox there, and we continue to need to progress to educate men and women about each other, so we can, each of us, regardless of our biological sex, regardless of our gender orientation, regardless of our sexual identity, gender identity, we can grow to be fully human beings who embody all of these traits: compassion and wisdom, justice and mercy, intimacy and solitude, agency and community, all of those. And the culture is far behind in terms of that kind of equality and full humanness. And it's going to remain that way as long as we have, people think that someone like Donald Trump is a good leader. I mean, he's a convicted rapist. He's he's been involved in probably close to 5,000 lawsuits now. It was 3,500 before he became president. He has no sense of loyalty to his supporters, but he demands loyalty from them. And tens of millions of Americans think that he's the right guy for the job. So there's this I'm moving a little bit away from the binary here, but that's still part of the patriarchy. And as Krishnamurti said, anybody who feels like that's good, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And that's what we have. And so the status quo is not particularly healthy.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was going to stop, put a pin in it again.
What's interesting is that, again, growing up, my brother, actually my grandmother first, was a huge wrestling fan. So I remember, when I was a kid, and I mean, she would watch wrestling, back then it would come on a certain, 7 o'clock at night, 8 o'clock at night. She would watch wrestling, and she knew all the wrestlers, and that kind of helped really form that love for wrestling in our minds. My mother skipped the generation. Mother didn't care about wrestling, still doesn't. I don't think she can even name 2 wrestlers if you ask her. But my brother really loves wrestling. And where I'm going with this is he still stayed on wrestling, still a big, huge fan. He's really a sports fan, but wrestling and football are definitely his favorite. And some people say wrestling is not really a sport, at least professional wrestling, the WWE. But what I will say to this is this, that they found a way to incorporate women into wrestling seamlessly, to the point where I don't think anyone has an issue with how, like, if you go watch a wrestling event or you watch wrestling on Monday night, Friday nights, the nights they come on, well, they made women wrestling a part of their event.
Yeah.
See, to me, wrestling understood their lane and said, we're entertainment. Bottom line, we're not sports first, we're entertainment first. And by being entertainers first, we're going to bring you the ultimate experience. Where to me, I think that sports such as professional sports, football, baseball, and basketball, they focus on being true more to the craft than they do entertainment, which is why people can go watch a wrestling match and the energy is like at a 10 the entire time from the time the show starts to the time the show ends, it's at a 10 the entire time. Where if you watch a football game, you have plays within that 4-hour window that get you excited, but for the most part, it's pretty like, oh, okay, you just watch and you can actually talk through it until you see a play that really excites you. And where I'm going with this is how they have women wrestlers, and the women wrestlers are pretty much celebrated. They have women wrestling matches, and it's been masterful how they've been able to really embody the feminine women's sports in a masculine. Again, wrestling is a very masculine, man-dominated thing. And they don't really have women fighting men too often in the ring. But my point is, I think they should be looked at and studied. I'm curious to see what kind of research people would have on wrestling to see how they were able to incorporate it in there and have it accepted. Even now, where Vince McMahon, who was the one that really took wrestling to a whole different level, which I consider him to really be a genius personally, just from watching the craft of wrestling, how he created the characters and how he's able to, like I said, expand it to the point where it is now at a global phenomenon. But now, recently, he's been brought up on, I think, either sexual charges, so he had to step down from the company. So it's interesting to see how someone who will look at as being, at least from looking at his product or his business, as a very open-minded man, accepting of women, things of that nature, is now being accused of sexual misconduct to a woman. But I'm not really using that as the issue. I'm just wondering the people who may be watching, it's like, well, he's mentioning Vince McMahon in a positive light, but just recently he was brought up on these charges. But my point I'm making at the end of the day is, I think that wrestling has created a model again of how really to integrate women into that. Because again, being entertainment and giving people what they want, I don't think it's if you're a wrestling fan, you don't have any complaints about the wrestling matches or the wrestling show at all.
Yeah, well, I think I agree with you, and I think you named it, because they know that they're an entertainment business. They know who's going to win, and in other sports, and in other entertainment that are considered professional sports, whether it's the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, professional golf, professional tennis, any of them. The competition is real. You don't know who's going to win. And what those venues, those particular sports have done, like the NBA did a great job with it. I think, NFL has done as well. I mean, going back to David Stern and back when, it was really Larry Bird and Magic Johnson X number of years ago, and then Jordan, and then forward, like they really saw the value in it, and they made the NBA entertaining. The NFL has done that as well, but they have to, honor the fact that it's a real competition. Although with the betting now, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not a big fan of watching like the games last night, and seeing, they're giving you the odds of if this player does this or this one does that, and how much money that's going to be. I think they're playing a slippery slope there. That's a separate issue. But yeah, the professional wrestling invited women into the fold because as a purely entertaining entity, they could do that, and then they could put they have women fighting women, wrestling against women, and sometimes they're actually in the ring with the men. But as you say, McMahon knew his product, he knew his target audience, and he was successful with that. And like a lot of successful entrepreneurs, it doesn't mean that his personal behavior was okay. Because you get powerful, you get money, and you can tell people what to do and what not to do, and you can manipulate people, and you can impose your will or your body on somebody. And I don't know if he's been found guilty or if you've been convicted or not, but that again, there's the patriarchal piece, because everything we're speaking about, I think without exception, I don't know that there's a sport or an entertainment genre beyond sports that was begun by women, because women were kept out of the workforce. I mean, just take the 247 years of this country. They didn't have access to equal education. They were kept out of the workforce. They expected to stay home and take care of the kids and clean up. And that was true right through, the 20th century, at least to the middle and, first 2/3 of the 20th century. So women are still playing catch up. But all of these entities that we're talking about, motion picture industry, television industry, sports industry, pick a sport, they were all developed by and originally participated in by men. I mean, can you think of one that was begun by women?
I can't.
Yeah. So women are playing catch up still in this male created world. Not talking about creation, the universe, although, some people on the far right Christianity say, well, yeah, even God, he's a guy. So it's a real, even the universe is part of the patriarchy, if you believe that. I don't. So
from a Western perspective, though.
What's that?
I said it's mostly from a Western perspective.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. So it's increasingly more subtle, but it's there because, women got a chance to get into higher education in the 19th century in the United States, and they got a chance to get into the voting booth in the early 20th century in the United States, and then they began to get some seats in the government. Actually, they had the first woman in Congress was there before she could vote. She was in there before 1920. God bless, I forget her name. But so it's all playing catch up in this male created society, culture, entertainment industry. And there's definitely progress, but there's still a long way to go because you're still considered kind of an out group. You're not the in group, and you really have to prove yourself in ways that the men coming in don't have to. And again, it's getting better, and it still has a long way to go. So I don't want to, dismiss either of those perspectives.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's definitely a lot more that can be said on this topic. Definitely a lot more I have to add, but I realize that we reached the top of the hour, and I know it's time to kind of bring this episode to a close. So I kind of want to shift into the part of the show where we want to provide some solutions or give people some ideas of how they can continue down their path to become more fully human. So what would you say are some of the things that people can begin to, who will listen to the show and understand the dynamics between the binary being raised as a male or a female based on patriarchal standards, and maybe want to, as they're raising their children going forward, be more fully human in how they begin to do that? What are some suggestions you would give?
Yeah, so there's a bunch coming to mind. I'll just say them kind of in a really linear fashion in no particular order. So one is if you do go to the movies or you watch television, whether it's watching sports or the news or whatever, and whether you're regardless of how you identify, this is for any human being, really tune into how you view these strangers on the screens, male or female. How do you really view that individual? More importantly, how do you view your boyfriend or your girlfriend? How do you view your mother or your father? Are there any biases in either direction, for or against men or women, in your view of the world? Check in there, because if there are no biases, I want to meet you and I want you to teach me, because I think we all have it at some level. So just tune in to how you really view others. Who do you admire, who you don't admire, from a gender perspective? And we're not going to get into sexual identity here, just from a gender perspective, a man or a woman. And that sounds unfair, I know, but just keep it moderately simple for this. That's the place to begin. And then what do you really, in terms of if you're a parent, how are you preparing your children for the world? Are your boys told to grow up and be rough and tough? And are your girls told to grow up to be nice and pretty? I have people in my family of origin, not in terms of my cousins and aunts and uncles. I heard that said when I was younger. The young boy was told, you're going to be rough and tough. The girl's going to be nice and pretty. That still goes on, not with everybody. But, do you see your son or daughter first as a fully human being and then as a boy or a girl? As you said at the top of the show, what's the true identity? So I'll stop there. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for that wonderful advice. And I believe that it's something that we all can begin to look at as we become more fully human or put ourselves on the path of becoming more fully human. So now we reach a part of the show. We want to give an example of someone who we feel, whether it's someone who is deceased and is past or someone who's currently present, who exhibits or has exhibited the qualities and characteristics of being fully human. And I will give you the opportunity to go first. Who do you see as your example of a fully human person today?
Yeah, so I'm going to go with a living person who is a historian and who's been in the public eye more and more in the last, I don't know if it's 5 or 6 years now, but Heather Cox Richardson, who began writing, I think it began on Facebook back around 2015 or 16, where she would just post a thing called Letters from an American. And she would give her view as a historian about what was going on in the United States. and beyond, but mainly in the United States. And that she now has a daily newsletter, which over 1 million people subscribe to, where she just tries to put the news into a historical perspective. And so I don't know her personally. So she seems like, I've heard her interviewed. She seems fully human to me, but she's doing really good work at a time when there's a lot of historical ignorance in this country. And so I'll call out Heather Cox Richardson as my example for today.
Well, the person I want to say is he's an author, columnist, as well as TV pundit, David Brooks. And the reason I choose David Brooks is because, again, as I learned more about him, I've known him. I first became aware of him by watching the PBS NewsHour and watching him as a conservative columnist. And even though, like I said, a lot of times we didn't really agree with his perspective, he always presented it with it was well thought through, thought out, and it wasn't one that was heavily biased from just, well, this is my tribe and let me defend my tribe kind of perspective that I see nowadays. And interesting enough, he was born as a Jewish man, later on switched over to Christianity. I think Catholicism, to be more specific, if I'm not mistaken. And he shifted his politics more to the left. Now, whether I agree with those shifts or not, what I really want to highlight him for is just the growth-minded. To me, that shows growth in an individual. Whether you start off Republican and move to Democrat move to Republican, if you can give a thought process as far as why you're doing that shift, and not just because you're identifying it based on the tribe characteristics, that to me shows growth. He's shown growth throughout his life. He continues to show growth because he's looking to grow. And that's what I really admire about the gentleman, is that he realizes that he doesn't have all the answers. And that today he's just interested in learning more about life and growing and culture and himself and I believe he's in his 60s, as someone who's who may be 15 and 20 years old, who still realizes I have a lot more to learn in life. And so I admire individuals who can sit here and say, this is how I used to think, but now I no longer think that way. And here's why. And that's why I believe, to me, he's showing the true definition of what it looks like to be on a path of becoming more fully human.
Yeah, I like Brooks a lot myself, and know him more from just reading his columns in the New York Times for I don't know how many years, but his growth is palpable. And we don't say that in an arrogant way, like, we watch him grow from where he used to be, but he just expanded his views a little bit at a time over some, more than a decade. So I love that you raised David Brooks as an example.
All right. Well, we reached the end of our show. We went over a little bit. I think it was worth it. I want to again thank you, Reggie, for initially writing a book, but also being present, being professional, and really making sure that we have great content to talk about each week and being prepared for the show. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank our listening audience for tuning in. Thank you for your patience for the last 2 weeks. We had some technical issues, so if you're still with us and you watching the show live, or if you're going to watch the replay, we appreciate it. We're grateful. Click the like and subscribe button on the YouTube channel. And remember, the show is every Monday at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we discuss ways to become more fully human and then build connections with it. So thank you all. Have a wonderful week. And that's all, strive to become more fully human.